Hello, everyone. Welcome to Spiritual Sunshine. Today we are diving right back into Swedenborg's book, Divine Love and Wisdom, exploring what he had to say about the levels of the universe, how God is embodied through everything, and what the purpose of the universe is. So stay with me and we'll reflect on these wise words from this 18th century mystical sage together. All right, so this is our last segment of Swedenborgianism 201, when we'll be diving into this book, Divine Love and Wisdom. There'll be more Swedenborgianism 201s, just not from this book. And you may encounter some ideas in Swedenborgian circles that I think tie directly into this book in particular. Not just having to do with the spiritual sun and the afterlife being kind of the emanation of God, although the Lord also appears to people in communities. God is emanating love and wisdom through the spiritual sun, but also in usefulness. Usefulness is an interesting term because I think often we think about work and how much work I'm getting done, all these random ideas about success, etc. But I think Swedenborg's ideas about usefulness, which inspired people like Emerson and others specifically, have more to do with something deeper, something more heavenly, let's say. God instilling spiritual wisdom, spiritual health, which leads to joy, which leads to peace and all these things in everyone, not just Christians, but in anyone and everyone willing to turn towards love, turn towards divinity in its fullness. Now, that doesn't mean that we each embody God or find God in fullness. We can't all receive infinite amounts of wisdom and love and action within, but we each encounter that fullness in our own way. And so let's dive into this book, see what Swedenborg has to say, and find out if there's anything in there for us in a practical way today. So jumping into part 4, I don't recommend following along. It'll be pretty tough. We're going to go pretty quick, but if you'd like, that's where we're starting. We're essentially going through part 4 of his book, Divine Love and Wisdom, which you can download for free at swedenborgiancommunity.org. And here he writes, "The Lord from eternity, who is Jehovah, created the universe and everything in it, not from nothing, but from himself." He goes on to say, "It is known worldwide and acknowledged through an inner perception by everyone who is wise that there is one God who is the creator of the universe. Further, the word informs us that the God who created the universe is called Jehovah, from the word for being, because God alone is." I think we all remember that line that God shares, I am that I am, I am, I am. In the teachings for the New Jerusalem on the Lord, there is ample evidence from the word that the Lord from eternity is that Jehovah. So Swedenborg, I think starts off with something many of us might take for granted, that God is one. But it may come to mind, well, what about like Hindu teachings and others that talk about these different manifestations of God? And how does God in 3 persons work in Christianity, etc.? Well, as you probably know if you're watching this video, of course, Swedenborg didn't believe in the 3 persons of the Godhead. He believed in a trinity of one person in the Godhead. We don't have to get into that too much today, but I think also reflecting on how many Hindus think about this can be insightful when it comes to how Swedenborg thought about this. Although many people have a conception, some may say a misconception, that Hinduism believes in many gods. If you talk to Hindu scholars, Hindu sages and nuns and priests, they often point to the oneness in God that all things have, and that the many depictions of God throughout the stories in the Vedas have to do with different aspects of God, different things about God. They're meant to teach, to express divinity in certain lights. And indeed, all things are rooted in that oneness. And so in a way, they would say everything is God. We'll hear something a bit similar from Swedenborg, funny enough, today, although he has a few caveats, of course. And I think thinking about it that way, that God is often expressed with different names. Even in the Bible, you may get different names of God within one chapter of the Bible. Recently, we've reflected on Revelation 19, I believe, in our sermons. And in that it says God's name is written on him. It's a name that only he knows. And it says God's name is the Word of God. And then it says that God's name is King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And he uses that word name each time. So if we want to take this literally, that we should know the name of God, it's asking us to know a name we don't know. It's asking us to know this name, that name. And of course, throughout the Bible, there are many other names for God. So I think in a way, it's actually speaking to something deeper, so that we come to know that mystery of God, the qualities of God that we can connect to in our heart, the true divine name of God in our own way. And each of those are just meant to express something about God, kind of like in Islam when it says God is compassionate, merciful, that God has the 99 different names, and actually even more. It's talking about all the expressions of divinity and how it's impossible to really nail God down in one specific way, one specific light. And so we hear Swedenborg kind of expressing the same thing. And then in this section of the book, of course, he's talking about how that oneness gives rise to everything. And so let's learn more. Jehovah is called the Lord from eternity because Jehovah took on a human nature in order to save us from hell. At that time, too, he commanded his disciples to call him, quote unquote, Lord. So in the New Testament, Jehovah is called the Lord. As we can tell from you shall love Jehovah your God with all your heart and all your soul from Deuteronomy 6. And also, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul in the New Testament from Matthew. So he's showing that in the Old Testament, it's using the word Jehovah your God or something that we translate that way. And in the New Testament, it's saying the Lord your God. We find the same in other Old Testament passages cited in the Gospels. He goes on to say, people who think rationally and clearly see that the universe was not created from nothing because they see that nothing can arise from nothing. I think this is an interesting argument, right? Often we think about how the universe started from nothing, mainly because we have no idea what happened before the Big Bang or whatever you want to think, started the universe. And so we like to imagine, maybe it just started from nothing. Maybe it's just repeating cycle. To explain how perfect the universe is, we usually say, well, if there were infinite universes, of course we'd be in the one that gives rise to us, because how else could we be around? But of course there's no true evidence of infinite universes or anything of the sort. And so I think this concept that maybe the universe in all its perfection arise from something greater than nothing, and we'll hear a little bit more about that, it's actually compelling, because I think it speaks to something truer about the universe and what we can get to know in ourselves, which is the everlasting true substance of spirit. He writes, nothing is simply nothing, and to make something out of nothing is self-contradictory. Anything that is self-contradictory is in conflict with the light of truth that comes from divine wisdom. And if something is not from divine wisdom, it is not from divine omnipotence either. Everyone who thinks rationally and clearly also sees that everything has been created out of a substance that is substance in and of itself. This is the essential being from which everything that exists can arise. Since only God is substance in and of itself and is therefore essential being, it follows that there is no other source of the arising of things. Wow, Swedenborg. You gave us enough to chew on in those couple sentences. Thank you. Yeah, so the essential being. At first we read that we may think an individual, and in a way, of course, he says Swedenborg says that God is a divine individual encompassing all individuals. But in a way, I think he's speaking to more kind of a grounded idea of being itself, awareness itself, divine love and wisdom itself. And I think when we reflect on that, we can start to get to know that we're in deep connection with this being, even without having to have certain spiritual experiences, going to church or this or that. We can find that we have a deep connection with awareness within, beingness itself. Indeed, as many sages, Hindu sages and Buddhist sages and others alike, often uplift, reflecting on being, reflecting on I am, that phrase that defines God, can often help us become grounded in that infinite spirit, that eternity, and to let go of all these self-contradictory things in our heads. There's a lot of contradictory things in our heads, although it's often hard to pinpoint them. Sometimes we say we want freedom and then we act in an opposite way. We think about the world in this light and then we undermine it. And I think the sages point to bigger contradictions, such as an awareness that everything is temporal, and yet we treat it like it's the end of the world if something small goes wrong, right? If we come to know infinity of spirit, then some of those contradictory things can be shed in a greater light. And it does take work to let go of. So when we're caught up in our fears, in our sense of divisiveness and difference from someone else, and we're judging them, it's often things that we don't want to think about ourselves, we judge other people for. That kind of thinking is contradictory. So letting go of that, letting go of the idea of separateness, etc., all that kind of divisive type of thinking, can help us heal our minds and let go of false contradictory things. So in a way, knowing these bigger concepts is one thing, and then putting them into practice, of course, often takes practice, often takes a road, or at least some letting go, which can be said to be the opposite of a journey, right? Often we work so hard to get somewhere, we forget that it's right here, and we just need to let go of that divisiveness, that striving, and that delusionary selfish thought, because the self in this light is a delusion. We're actually one in divinity. So let's jump ahead. Swedenborg later writes, "The Lord from eternity, or Jehovah, could not have created the universe and everything in it except as a person." So this ties into what we mentioned earlier. He writes, "If people have an earthly physical concept of the divine human one," all in capital letters, "they are utterly incapable of understanding how a human God could create the universe and everything in it." So even though Swedenborg believed in Jesus as the incarnation of God, he also believed that many people can connect to God without believing in the historical Jesus. More, getting to know Jesus today, even if we have different names for God, getting to know the love of God, the compassion of God, the justice of God, the social justice of God, is more important than knowing, 2,000 years ago, I know Jesus lived. So living in a way that follows Christ, believing in a way that follows Christ versus a historical belief that often doesn't always touch on how we live, how we feel about others, how we treat others. That first one's more important. And so here he's saying, so you may have a belief in Jesus as a human, a person, but thinking about God, realizing that God is greater than that, just as Revelation 19 describes, as we reflected on earlier this week, can really expand our minds about God and ourselves included. He says, the people who think only in this limited way about God think to themselves, how can a human God wander from place to place through the universe creating things? Or how can God speak from one place and things be created as soon as the word is spoken? Things like this come to mind when people say that God is a person, if people are thinking about the divine human one the same way they do about earthly people. And when their thought about God is based on nature and its attributes, time and space. On the other hand, if their thought about God is not based on earthly people, not based on nature and its space and time, they grasp clearly that the universe could not have been created unless God were a person. So I love this because Swedenborg often says, well, you have to know God as a person because otherwise, you'll cut off all these things about God. It's like saying God can't be anything like a person, but also calling God compassionate and merciful, all those terms. being wise and loving, etc., have to do with personhood, even if it's divine personhood. Here, he's actually breaking down the word person so that it's expanded in our minds. And I think that's important to note, because sometimes we notice that first thing, that God has to be a person according to Swedenborg, and we forget that Swedenborg, like many mystics, breaks down the term and changes it. So, it's good to keep his kind of change terms in mind as we read through his mystical thought from a few hundred years ago. He writes, focus your thought on the angelic concept of God, of a human God, and as far as you can, eliminate any concept of space, and you will be close to the truth in your thinking. So eliminate any concept of earthly space, any concept of space in your thinking, but reflect on what it means to be a divine human. I think I need to hear more. What are you talking about, Swedenborg? He says, some scholars have actually grasped the fact that spirits and angels are not in space because they conceive of spirit as being apart from space. Spirit is like thought. Even though our thought is within us, it enables us to be present somewhere else, no matter how far away. This is the state of spirit and angels, who are people even in respect to their bodies. They seem to be wherever their thought is because in the spiritual world, place and distance are apparent only and are in complete accord with what people are thinking about with interest. Okay, so he's painting this picture of a spiritual realm that seems to have space and time, but they're only apparent. So your mind is where your interests are. So if your mind's in heaven, it's because the things about heaven interest you and you're focused on them, also in your motivation and action. If you're in hell, according to Swedenborg, it's not like, I think, some of our old conceptions of hell, where there's a bouncer in front of heaven and he kicks you out or doesn't let you in because you got God's name wrong or something. In Swedenborg's conception of hell, you're interested in the things about hell. They could be self-dominance, hurting others, etc. All the things that kind of come from this diluted idea of self and our deep attachment to self and self-gratification. And so your mind can be in hell because you are very interested there. So I think that's a good clarification on his part. And I'll also note that he mentions angels, but according to Swedenborg, angels are just people or aliens in heaven. And that's what makes an angel. A lot of us have other ideas about angels. We can continue to disagree with Swedenborg, that's fine. But his idea of angels were people living in heaven. And in fact, he said he had experience of angels as just that, as people who had kind of gone through the middle realm of the spiritual world, continued to learn and decided that their interest and their heart lies in heaven. All right, where did we leave off? Here we are. We can tell from this that God, who is visible as a sun far above the spiritual world, who cannot be given any appearance of space, is not to be thought of in spatial terms. In that case, we can understand that the universe was not created out of nothing, but out of God, and that God's human body is not to be thought of as large or small, or of some particular height, because these are matters of space. You ever wonder, how tall was Jesus? If Jesus was like 4'3", and he appeared again, would we be like, I thought you'd be bigger? He's saying, no, don't think about Jesus's height, or God's height, Allah's height, Sophia, Krishna's height. Of course, God transcends any earthly incarnation or appearance of an angel or anything like that. He says this means that God is the same from first to last in the largest and smallest things. It means also that this person with capital P is at the heart of everything created, but non-spatially so. So he's at the heart of everything, but not in space. And I think he's saying that's because God transcends space. God made space. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. I actually find it pretty interesting because he paints a good picture of how the spiritual world gives rise to the natural world, and how God's emanating spirit is incarnate and born through it and uplifted as we ourselves grow, evolve, and connect with God and each other in healthy community. So jumping a little further ahead, he writes, as for God's inability to create the universe and everything in it except as a person, this is something a discerning individual can grasp very clearly on the following basis. Inwardly, we cannot deny that love and wisdom, mercy, and forgiveness exist in God. God is the source of what is good and true, is their essence. So I like that he's painting a picture of God. He's done it earlier in the book as well, as being good and true. Sometimes our conception of God connects with more hurtful things, more hurtful depictions of him. Of course, Swedenborg read the Bible as very symbolic. He said that the literal sense of the word was important as its ground, but the real meaning of the scriptures were kind of like Jesus's parables. They were meant to uplift spirit in us. We tell these stories about Abraham and Isaac and even the wars of the Israelites, and we're usually pulling out lessons for ourselves. So that kind of parable. He points out that even though God is sometimes depicted as judgmental and wrathful, this is more the literal sense, how God seems to people at times. But God is in truth loving and all about goodness and truth itself. So he goes further and writes, God as the source of what is good and true is their essence. Since we cannot deny this, we cannot deny that God is a person. Since none of these things can exist apart from a person. The person is their subject, and to separate them from their subject is to say that they do not exist. So all these things about goodness and truth and love, we know them as from people. They're in people. And so he's saying if you're thinking about this kind of thing as being part of God, you need to acknowledge that it's in a person, that God is a person. Maybe not in the same way we think of others, but maybe in a truer way, honestly. And he says, think of wisdom and visualize it as outside a person. Is it anything? Can you conceive of it as something ethereal or flame-like? No, unless perhaps you think of it as within these things. And if it is within them, it must be wisdom in a form like ours. It must be in every aspect of that form. Nothing can be lacking if wisdom is to be within it. In brief, the form of wisdom is human. Because a person is a form of wisdom, a person is also a form of love, mercy, forgiveness, of whatever is good and true, because these act in complete unison with wisdom. Okay, I think he's made his case. We can take it or leave it. But I think that makes sense to me, that this has to do with people, and these terms have to do with people, and that in God and in its divine form, it's in a divine person. Jumping ahead, he writes, he's talking about the Son in the spiritual world, how it's not the Lord, but an emanation from God. And he says it's an emanation from the Lord's divine love and wisdom. It is called an emanation because that Son is brought forth from the divine love and wisdom that in and of themselves are substance and form, and divinity emanates by means of it. So this spiritual Son that angels see in the spiritual world is an emanation from God. It's not God himself, not God herself, and God uses that emanation to shed light and warmth. Spiritual light and warmth being wisdom, light, and love, warmth. You can also call it truth and goodness, etc. So it's kind of like in the physical world, God uses the physical stars, the physical suns, to shed physical light and warmth. And so that kind of connection isn't, an accident. Indeed, I think the visualization of a spiritual sun isn't just, for similarity's sake, but because human beings respond to it. We're meant to connect with this kind of symbolism. In the spiritual world, there are still environments, there are still bodies and buildings, according to Swedenborg, that relate to who we are, how we are within. And so that spiritual sun is kind of like our own sun, shedding light and warmth. And that space that allows the light and warmth to shine allows us to live as human beings and to receive it in our own way. He goes further to write, I've had many conversations with angels about this emanation from the Lord. They've told me that they grasp it clearly in their spiritual light, but that it is almost impossible for them to present it to us in our earthly light because there is such a difference between the two kinds of light, and therefore between their thoughts and ours. They did say, though, that it is like the aura of feelings and consequent thoughts that surround every angel, through which angels' presence is established for people both nearby and at a distance. This surrounding aura, we're getting into auras here, which is cool, of angels, is not the actual angel, but it is derived from every part of the angel's body. Coherent substances flow from it like a river, and the emanations envelop them. Interesting. These substances bordering angels' bodies, substances constantly energized by the two fountains of their life, the heart and lungs, stir the atmospheres into their activities, and in this way establish a sense of the angel's virtual presence among others. Not this kind of virtual presence, although maybe this is similar. I think we're connected virtually with our auras even in this spiritual community. This means that there is not a separate aura of feelings and consequent thoughts that go forth in connected fashion, even though that is what we call it, because the feelings are simply states of the forms of the mind within. The angels went on to say that all angels have this kind of aura around them because the Lord does, and that the aura around the Lord is similarly derived from Him. This aura is their sun, or the sun of the spiritual world. So hundreds of years ago, I think long before auras got very popular in pop culture or whatever, Swedenborg's writing about auras of angels. So maybe this is part of the root, the spiritual root of why some of us, think about auras. And of course, some people say they have real experiences of auras. So that's another root which ties into this. And he's saying that kind of aura for the Lord is embodied in the spiritual sun that shares light and warmth that angels also receive and share in their own ways to others. The spiritual sunshine that we sometimes like to reflect on in this community. Now, jumping further ahead, continuing our exploration of all these kind of interesting details about what Swedenborg thought about the creation of the universe, how God shared parts of himself, part of herself with us, and the spiritual world and how everything kind of fits together. He writes, there are three things in the Lord that are the Lord: a divine element of love, a divine element of wisdom, and a divine element of service. These three things are made visible outside of the sun of the spiritual world: the divine element of love through its warmth, the divine element of wisdom through its light, and the divine element of service through the atmospheres that enclose it. On the emanation of warmth and light from the spiritual world's sun, warmth from the Lord's divine love, and light from the Lord's divine wisdom, review before. And we had a whole video about this in the 201 video about the spiritual sun. I invite you to check it out. It's pretty interesting. He says, I now need to note that the third thing that emanates from the sun there is an atmosphere that serves as the vessel of warmth and light, kind of like our atmosphere with the sun's warmth and light, and that it emanates from that divine aspect of the Lord that is called service. Anyone who thinks with some enlightenment can see that love has service as its goal, that love tends toward service, and that love about service through wisdom. Love brings service through wisdom. Okay, so service is the goal of love. It's kind of like if you love someone, you want to help them. You want to serve them and uplift them, empower love's joy, love's light in them. And so that makes sense to me. He writes further, in fact, love cannot accomplish anything useful by itself. only by means of wisdom. After all, what is love unless there is something that is loved? That something is service. Service is what is loved, and since it is brought forth by means of wisdom, it follows that service is the vessel of love and wisdom. So if you don't have any wisdom, if you don't have any knowledge and how to put that knowledge into practice, then you can't do anything with your love. You may love the cookie in a cookie jar, but you have to know how to get it. It takes wisdom to get it, to fulfill that love. And if you love others, if you love community, then it takes wisdom to serve them. And service, it says, is the vessel of love and wisdom. So within that action, within that space of service, you're expressing love and wisdom, you're conveying it. Interesting enough, huh? He writes, I will be explaining at ample length later that if you look at both the inner and the outer aspects of humans, we are a form suited to all kinds of service, and that all the useful functions in the created universe have their equivalents in these kinds of service. So I like that our first real notice of the word usefulness in Swedenborg's writings today has to do with service. It's not, how much money did I make, etc., because as we know, that's not necessarily directly connected with service. Indeed, sometimes service is sharing wealth, uplifting others where they are. So I appreciate that connection. At this point, I need only mention it in order to call attention to the fact that God as a person is the very form suited to all kinds of service, the one in whom all useful functions in the created universe find their source, Swedenborg writes. This means that in terms of its useful functions, the created universe is an image of God. So as we know in modern physics, everything in the created universe is an image of the bigger part. The microcosm reflects the whole. Even though everything seems, very different, of course, obviously, there's actually so many similarities within every single, even the smallest things, to different animals, etc., that they reflect the whole and how they work. And it's been an amazing thing for scientists to discover and realize. And Swedenborg has a good explanation for this in the 1700s. He's saying everything within the universe, in small and in whole, is an image of God. It reflects divinity, that divine personhood. Okay, well, what else do you have to say about this, Swedenborg? He writes, by useful functions, I mean those processes that were created by the divine human one or the Lord as part of the design. I do not mean activities that derive from our own self-concern. So often the things we think about when we think of usefulness, right? He's not talking about that. He says that concern is hell, and its activities violate the design. So all the things we do from self-concern and defensiveness, that's connected to hell. That's why we're so anxious in it. We're so fearful in it. And I have it too, right? I think Swedenborg also had his process of letting go of it. And that's why often Christ and many other spiritual teachers throughout time, all the ways that the Lord has talked to us, uplifts letting go of fear about the future, letting go of our hoarding of cash and everything, and instead turning to loving, compassionate service and following God in that way. And being open to people of diverse faiths, diversity, and embracing them, uplifting the goodness in them, just as Christ did. Often we talk about following Christ and we make it more about our self-concerns than what Christ actually said it was about. I think that's why he says, why say, Lord, Lord, not do what I told you to do? A lesson for pretty much all of us. And so here he's saying, okay, that self-concern, it's violating the design of God, and it's connecting us with hell. It is hell, he says. Now we're jumping a few sections down the line to number 307, if you're that crazy individual trying to follow along. Thanks for connecting and doing that, because this book's pretty great. I recommend reading it to everyone. He writes, all useful functions, which are the goals of creation, are in forms. And they get these forms from the material substances characteristic of earth. Okay, so the goals of creation are these useful functions, and they're all in forms. He writes, all the things I have been talking about so far, the sun, the atmospheres, and the earth, are simply means towards goals. And the goals of creation are what are brought forth from earth by the Lord as the sun through the atmospheres. These goals are called useful functions, and they include everything involved in the plant kingdom, everything involved in the animal kingdom, and ultimately the human race and the angelic heaven that comes from it. So the Lord, as Swedenborg wrote, isn't the sun, the spiritual sun, but uses this sun to shed love and warmth, and all that gives rise to the physical suns that also share, a more natural light and warmth, and all these things give rise to these useful functions that are in the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the animal kingdom, and ultimately the human race, that lead to the angelic heaven. And we'll learn more about, what is he actually talking about when he's saying all these things are useful. These are called useful functions because they are receptive of divine love and wisdom, and because they focus on God the Creator as their source, and thereby unite him with his masterwork in such a way that they continue to exist through him in the same way they arose. I say they focus on God the Creator as their source and unite him with their masterwork, but this is talking in terms of the way things seem. It actually means that God the Creator works it out so that these useful functions seem to focus on and unite themselves to him on their own initiative. So God works it out that we unite ourselves to God in our own initiative. It seems like we're doing it. He works it out so that we do it that way. And that not only human beings do that, but the entire created universe is worked out so that it unites itself to God. He writes, since the subject is the forms of useful functions, I need to discuss them in the following sequence. 1, Earth has an active tendency to bring forth useful functions, in particular forms, or forms of useful functions. 2, in all such forms, there is some image of the creation of the universe, and as he said before, some image of God. And 3, in all such forms, there is some human image. And 4, in all such forms, there is some image of what is infinite and eternal. So there you go. And we won't step through each of these in an in-depth way, but I think it's interesting, this idea, because we learn in science, of course, that from the smallest things to the largest, particle physics, all of the substances of the material universe come together to create more and more greater complex things, maybe greater complex useful things. So, everything we know about quarks and photons and all those subatomic particles, they come together to create greater particles that come together as desperate parts, almost like a community, right? To create something greater, and those come together, and eventually you get minerals, you get plants, and you get animals and humans. And so we see, even in our science, this image of all these useful things. Even dark matter, which we know very little bit about, allows for the right amount of gravity for these things to come together in such a great way. So we see useful functions and forms around us, and he's kind of painting that all these things are in the image of each other, and ultimately in the image of what's infinite and eternal, God. Reading a little bit more about his first point, that Earth has an active tendency to bring forth useful functions in particular forms, or forms of useful functions, he writes, the presence of this tendency in the Earth is a corollary of its origin, since the material substances that make up the Earth are boundaries and limits of the atmospheres that come from the spiritual sun as useful functions. So he explains this more in some sections we kind of breeze past, that the spiritual sun has these atmospheres that have their kind of ends, their limits, their boundaries in the material world. So you can think of the spiritual world as being kind of within everything, and the material energy, the material realm, the material forms around us are the boundaries, the limits of that spiritual atmosphere, those spiritual atmospheres. And indeed, as we know, all materiality is energy itself. And so it kind of makes sense that this energetic form comes from divine awareness, comes from a divine love and wisdom, a divine sun, because it all is energy ultimately, right? And so he's saying the boundaries and limits of these atmospheres come forth in useful functions in the material realm. Further, since the material substances that make up the earth are from this source, and since their compounds are constantly held together by the surrounding pressure of the atmospheres, it follows that this gives them a constant active tendency to bring forth forms of useful functions. So he's saying this kind of usefulness from God in its boundaries in the atmospheres applies consistent types of pressure to each different thing to be useful in its way. So he's talking about the active creation of everything around us in every moment. He says they derive their very ability to bring these forth from their origin as the boundaries of the atmospheres with which they are therefore in harmony. Okay, well, it goes a little bit above my head, but I think the more I reflect on that, the more it makes sense. And I think it's beautiful in the sense that it ties so well with modern science and physics today. Now, going further ahead to 3:18, in all such forms, there is some image of what is infinite and eternal. We can see an image of the infinite in these forms, from the tendency and potentiality of filling the space of the whole world and even of many worlds without end. Now he's talking about plant life, how plants reproduce so quickly, and he'll describe it pretty beautifully in a moment. They could fill every world if we, harness everyone, if we took care of everyone and let the seeds, land fruitfully as much as possible. He says a single seed brings forth a tree, a shrub, or a plant, and that takes up its own space. From each tree, shrub, or plant, there comes more seeds, in some cases thousands of them. Assuming these to be planted and to have sprouted, they take up their spaces, and if from each of their seeds new generations arise again and again, after a few years the whole world is full. If the propagation continues, any number of worlds is filled, and so on to infinity. Figure on 1,000 seeds coming from one, and then multiply 1,000 by 1,000, 10 or 20 or 100 times, and you'll see. So, some basic math for many of us in this day and age, if you just multiply a couple thousands together and do it 10 to 100 more times, you get numbers that are pretty much hard to fathom. And so he's saying that's an image of the infinity of God. We see an image of the infinity of God in just a seed, in just a plant. Further, he writes, from a functional point of view, everything in the created universe is in our image, and this testifies that God is human. It's funny that Swedenborg ties the word human so much into this when he has such an interesting definition of human, because he's including aliens here, he's including anything that can become angelic. And indeed, as he said, everything even below human is in the image of God. So in a way, if he's saying God is human, everything's in the image of humanity. So that kind of breaks down our ideas about what it means to be human. I think it's important to keep in mind. And sometimes I find it gets a little wonky, because if we're talking about everything being human, then what's the difference between, my type of human and animal life? Of course, he talks about the difference in sentience, but if everything's an image of God, then every plant is in the image of God and its divine humanity and God's divine humanity. And so let's allow the Lord to kind of shed some light into our reading of this as we dive a little further in. The ancients called the individual person a microcosm because each of us reflects the macrocosm, that is, the universe in its entirety. Nowadays, though, people do not know why the ancients gave us this name. Nothing of the universe or the macrocosm is visible in us except that we are nourished by its animal and plant kingdoms and are physically alive, that we are kept alive by its warmth, see by its light, and hear and breathe by its atmospheres. These things, though, do not make us a microcosm the way the universe and everything in it is a macrocosm. Rather, the ancients learned to call us a microcosm or little universe from the knowledge of correspondences that the earliest people enjoyed and from their communication with angels of heaven. Heaven's angels actually know from what they see around themselves that if we focus on functions, we can see an image of a person in everything in the universe. It's funny, the San Diego supercomputer lab at UC San Diego, I think it's San Diego, they found that when they put the functions of the larger universe into a supercomputer and then functions of different levels of the universe, including much smaller things, they found these corollaries they weren't expecting, this deep parallel nature of all these functions. I think this speaks to this kind of microcosm-macrocosm relationship that Swedenborg is pointing to, that when we start looking at the functions of everything around us and within us, we see that they all image each other, as we're finding in science, and that's all imaging God. It's all a reflection of divinity, of that divine love, wisdom, and service that's at the root of our hearts, our souls. Jumping ahead, he writes, all of the Lord's creations are useful functions. And they are useful functions in the sequence, on the level, and in the specific way that they relate to humanity, and through humanity to the Lord, their source. So, Swedenborg is making the case that humanity, sentient level life, intelligent sentient life, in a way is the crux of a lot of what is so-called below and speaks to what's above. And he's pretty sure about this. So, some of us may like to see divinity in nature, and there's a good reason for it, but he's saying the true shining example of an image of God, maybe that's why it says image and likeness in Genesis, is humanity, is male, female, non-binary, all of humanity. Indeed, Swedenborg's definition of humanity includes aliens. So, if you think people are strange here, just wait until you meet, a few sentient races from other planets, right? So that's his idea of humanity and the importance of humanity. It's similar to a lot of Buddhist thought that says human being is a very special level because it gives us opportunity to reconnect with our source and transcend the hell that is reincarnation. Indeed, Buddhism often talks about hell in even more starker terms in the Bible, but often that depiction of hell is either hellish worlds being reincarnated into, or the hell of being sent back down through reincarnation. Crazy enough. So Buddhism, we often say, doesn't have hell, talks about hell a lot. Read some of those scriptures, are interesting. And kind of like Swedenborg, it epitomizes being human as being this very rare thing that allows us to reconnect with God. One other thing that Buddhism says that many of us tend to change, I think the West, kind of read into Buddhism what it wanted, that Buddhists have no deity. Well, in a way you could say that, although in some Buddhist texts, a creator speaks through it. In Buddhist texts, it often says, continue to worship the deity, your deity, and then realize we're one in that deity, in that awareness. It says it over and over again, don't give up the worship of your deity. So this idea that Buddhism is entirely disconnected with the long-standing ancient history of human beings having an awareness of the absolute, I would disagree and suggest a reperusal of Buddhist scriptures. Jumping to 329, he writes, we can tell what a useful function is from the goal of the creation of the universe. The goal of the creation of the universe is to bring about an angelic heaven. And since an angelic heaven is the goal, so is humanity, or the human race, since that is where heaven comes from. It follows then that everything that has been created is an intermediate goal, and that the functions are useful in the sequence, on the level, and in the specific way that they relate to humanity, and through humanity to the Lord. Since the goal of creation is a heaven from the human race, and therefore the human race itself, the intermediate goals are everything else that has been created. Because these do relate to us, they focus on these three aspects of us: our bodies, our rational functioning, and for the sake of our union with the Lord, our spiritual functioning. We cannot be united to the Lord unless we are spiritual. We cannot be spiritual unless we are rational, and we cannot be rational unless we are physically whole. This reminds me of what the founding father of the Salvation Army said, William Booth, that if people are drunk or hungry, they're not going to listen to what I have to say about God. And so he decided to give to people food, help people break from addiction, and to connect people with resources, as well as provide church services. Yes, the Salvation Army is a church. It's more in the fundamentalist guise, but it does a lot of great work out there, and uplifts a lot of people from poverty, from harsh circumstances. Something we can emulate, I think. And he writes, these aspects are like a house, with the body as its foundation, the structure of the house as our rational functioning, and the contents of the house as our spiritual functioning. Living in the house is union with the Lord. So when we have all these things working well, we're in union with the Lord. Interesting. It's good to know. So, it's important that we uplift these different aspects of human beings. And I think that's where service in its kind of most obvious form, service and charitable donations, charitable help, getting out there, uplifting people in different ways, goes a long way, because it allows the foundation of this house and for the house itself to exist so that a person can truly be united with God. Going a little further, he writes, it follows from this that the purpose of the useful functions the Lord provides for himself through us is that he may bless us out of his love. And since this is what he loves to do, our receiving it is the joy of his love. So it's speaking to why is this, God's purpose? Well, it's because God loves to do that. God loves to uplift people, to have others to serve. God loves to send his love through others, send her divine wisdom through others, that empower God in others so that they can have similar joy, similar freedoms, similar peace. Sounds pretty great. 336. Evil functions were not created by the Lord. Rather, they came into being along with hell. He writes, all good things that find expression and act are called functions, and all evil things that find expression and act are also called functions. The latter, though, are called evil functions, while the former are called good functions. Since everything good is from the Lord and everything evil from hell, it follows that only good functions have been created by the Lord, and that all the evil ones have come from hell. So, history lesson from Swedenborg, he won't get into it here, is that the depiction of the Garden of Eden and the fall of Adam and Eve to Swedenborg is a symbolic story about how human beings originally evolved to be in deep connection with God, to be in a spiritual Garden of Eden. But as we turn towards selfishness, selfish thought, divisive thinking, dividing ourselves and creation, dividing ourselves from God, fear, etc., we left the garden. That brought us spiritually out of the Garden of Eden. And not just one, two people, but that represented all of humanity at the time. And so this kind of fall from grace started developing a self-centeredness that isn't of heaven. That freedom to turn towards this is from God. So there is freedom from God to turn towards evil, in the sense that God allows us to turn away from divinity and to focus on ourselves instead. But that's for our spiritual freedom. That's for creation to exist. Our centeredness on that, our coming to love it, started crafting hell. And that hell is transient in a sense. It's delusional, it's false. God sees it as nothing. Although God sees the details within it, ultimately God knows that it's transient in such a way. It's so shallow, it's practically nothing to God. And as we'll see from Swedenborg, it has its purpose. And that isn't created directly from God. It's us using our powers of creation to uncreate, to focus on destructiveness and hurtfulness, at least for a time. He says, the particular functions I am talking about in this section are all the things we see on earth, like all kinds of animal and all kinds of plant. In both instances, the ones that are God for us are from the Lord, and the ones that do us harm are from hell. By the same token, useful functions from the Lord means all the things that help develop our rational ability and that enable us to be receptive of spiritual gifts from the Lord, while evil functions means everything that destroys our rational ability and makes it impossible for us to become spiritual. So yeah, he's talking about how usefulness is also found, especially found, in all the things that help us to be rational. So I think scientific light, when applied rationally, applied fruitfully, in the way that it's defined, can lead to more rationality. So I don't think science is an issue. Just like spirituality, if it's healthy, is not an issue. Even in the most horrific times in Christian history and other places where the religion was being misused for horror, other people were using it to uplift others. And so you can use any tool for positive or negative, and something as strong as spirituality, as Christ's words, unfortunately can very much be leveraged towards harm. Just like I think science can eventually be, or can be, as we see with the atomic bomb, with people misusing scientific principles and testing on people, etc. But refining the rightful, the more rational approach to each of these things is part of God's order. It's part of God's usefulness within and through us. He writes, the reason harmful things are called useful functions, quote unquote, is that they are useful to evil people for their evil doing, and also because they serve to soak up malice and therefore lead to remedies. So he's saying, in a way, evil functions, harmful things, kind of sometimes collect together other evil things, and that actually helps us be able to remedy against them. It's kind of interesting idea, but it makes sense to me. He writes, I use useful functions in this dual sense and do the same with love. Speaking of a good love and an evil love, whatever love brings forth, it calls useful. So he's kind of pointing out that he uses love with evil things as well. It's not love with a capital L, but it's this kind of centeredness, this affection towards evil functions. And that is all we're going to cover in Divine Love and Wisdom in our 201 series. And ultimately, I think it paints a pretty thorough picture, although we skip some pretty hefty parts, about how Swedenborg viewed the universe and how it connects with usefulness, connects with love, wisdom, and service, and all comes back to being connected with divinity in its diversity, and uplifting rationality, love, and goodness within and around us. Now, if you have any questions about today's video, please share your feedback, your questions, your thoughts, your concerns. Follow, subscribe. We love hearing from you folks. And go forth knowing that you are quite loved. Bye.